B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, September 21st, 2018. It was within the last 48 hours, I can't remember if it was yesterday or on Wednesday, that I was commenting on the unusual self-control being displayed by the guy in the White House. And in particular, his rather constrained remarks about Christine Blasey Ford, the accuser of his Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanuagh. But it didn't last long. Trump and self-control? I think you will rarely hear those terms used in the same sentence again. His self-control has returned to zero. And I guess it loosened up at a rally, one of his mob gatherings in Las Vegas last night, where, of course, he went off on the radical Democratic partisans who were blocking his Supreme Court plan. And he then, of course, could not resist taking to the Twitter machine. So our dear tweeter this morning, I have no doubt that if the attack on Dr. Ford was as bad as she says, charges would have been immediately filed with local law enforcement authorities by either her or her loving parents. I ask that she bring these filings forward so that we can learn date, time, and place. Well, he knows those don't exist. She has been very clear in her interview with the Washington Post and in the original letter that she wrote to Senator Feinstein that she didn't share this information with her parents or with the cops. And this is, certainly, if you're just being cold and objective about it, one of the weaknesses of her claim. But it's very common that teenage girls who are sexually groped, who are sexually assaulted, who are victims of attempted rape or actual rape. We'll get to the details. I've got some statistics for you about that in a moment. But it is extremely common. And it's also fair to say that false reports of rape and attempted rape are very rare. Happens about 7% of the time. So at this hour, I'm speaking to you about 2 p.m. Pacific time on Friday. It is unclear whether the Senate Judiciary Committee, chaired by Chuck Grassley, will go forward with some sort of a hearing on Monday, because we've been told that Dr. Christine Blasey Ford won't be there on Monday, but maybe Thursday. And it really rankles them that she is not agreeing to simply submit to the demands and the terms and the schedule made by the Republicans who control the Judiciary Committee. Now, today, she's meeting with FBI agents to discuss security for herself and her family after they have received threats, including death threats. And, of course, it's bizarre that she can schedule a meeting with the FBI to talk about that, but the FBI is not interested in expanding the background check of Brett Kavanuagh to include any kind of investigation of her allegations. And in the interview that she gave, the only one with the Washington Post, she said she was terrified that she would be in trouble if her parents realized she'd been at a party where teenagers were drinking, and she worried that they might figure it out even if she didn't tell them. And I don't know about you, but I have episodes in my teenage history where I concealed things from my parents. Including that time my girlfriend got drunk at a party. I didn't drink, but I brought her home and she puked all over the place, and I got caught running the washing machine at 3 a.m. And the issue is not so much whether Kavanaugh is guilty of what is described by some as attempted rape. I think that's a little extreme. I think he was in the early stages of sexual assault when she broke free. And his intentions in a reported drunken state are pretty hard to calculate at this point. The issue is, has Kavanaugh lied about it? And it is his honesty and his credibility that really are the central issue in his entire confirmation process. But Mitch McConnell, leader of the Republicans, he spoke to a group of his fans at the Values Voter Summit. Here's what I want to tell you. In the very near future, Judge Kavanaugh will be on the United States Supreme Court. Keep the faith. Don't get rattled by all this. We're going to plow right through it and do our job. And, of course, he views his job as packing the court with right-wingers, including a 51-year-old guy who will presumably serve for 30, if not 40 years. And last night, Rachel Maddow exposed how Chuck Grassley says, well, we've got investigators who are looking into Dr. Ford's allegations. And the lead investigator is a counselor, a lawyer, to Grassley, who is tweeting his determination to see Brett Kavanuagh confirmed. That's hardly an unbiased investigator. And, you know, it amuses me when I see a tweet from Trump saying that Kavanaugh is under assault by radical left-wing politicians. I wish we had some radical left-wing politicians in this country. Come on. An attorney for Dr. Ford has suggested several conditions to her appearance before the Judiciary Committee, that Kavanaugh must testify first. That's an interesting move. So he will issue denials that she would then chip away at. And they want to maintain that Ford and Kavanaugh are not in the hearing room at the same time. The attorney said that Ford will not be there Monday and is not submitting the written testimony by the arbitrary deadline that was set for this morning. And according to The Guardian, Ford is asking for the hearing on Capitol Hill to be moved to next Thursday. Now, that undermines her claim that she wanted an FBI investigation before she would agree to the hearing. But I do understand it's a fluid situation, and there have been, terms bounced back and forth between the Judiciary Committee and the lawyers for Ford. And the other angle here is that she's also insisting that she be questioned by actual members of the committee, the all-white male Republicans who form the majority, and not an outside hired gun. There's been talk that the Republicans would engage a female barrister who would come in and, the way often rape subjects or suspects hire a female lawyer to attack the accuser because, of the woman thing. And the idea that a woman who attacks an accuser isn't as cruel as a man who does the same. It's optics, and I think that Ford is correct to avoid that, but I don't know that she has the leverage to insist on it. So here's the data I referred to a moment ago. A 2015 Washington Post Kaiser Family Foundation survey of current and recent college students found that 88% of women who experienced unwanted sexual conduct did not tell police or university authorities about the incidents. And the result was the same among women who reported sexual assault by force or threat, as well as those who were incapacitated or unable to give consent. 88% didn't report it. But you're going to hear these Republican elderly male senators insist that they know better, that their hindsight of what Christine Blasey should have done, and Trump, who has been accused by 12 women and doesn't acknowledge the need of those women to be heard or the experiences that they had with him. Well, as we pointed out, he is the least credible person in the entire country to play the role that he is assuming at the moment. A good commentary by Rebecca Solnit, published at The Guardian. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. And she says, we are seeing it again with Professor Ford. Her credibility and character are being preemptively attacked even before we knew who she was. She was promptly doxxed when the Washington Post revealed her identity. We know why the more than 60 women who say Bill Cosby assaulted them from the 1960s through recent years mostly didn't speak up before 2014. We know why Harvey Weinstein's alleged victims didn't speak up, and how a whole apparatus existed of threats, lawyers, spies to keep them silent. We know that the teenage victims of Dr. Larry Nassar, who spoke up, were for the most part not believed by the school, the police, or even their parents. We know that a groundswell of feminism made it possible for many women to be heard for the first time starting last October with the cataclysm of testimony we call Me Too. And I want to say that in recent days on Facebook, I have seen a lot of women, for the first time, post revelations about their own incidents of sexual assault. And it's really chilling. It truly is. This is a problem that really does amount to rape culture. And we know that it's not going to be addressed in this process with Brett Kavanuagh, as the Republicans are determined to get him on the court at all costs. But returning to the Solnit commentary, she quotes David J. Morris, a Marine Corps veteran, the author of The Evil Hours, a book about PTSD, trauma, and memory. And he says, most men have no idea how truly traumatic sexual assault is. And I think that's very fair. I think most men, once they orgasm, they don't look back at that encounter and think about it in any meaningful way. He goes on to say, the science on the subject is pretty clear. According to the New England Journal of Medicine, rape is about 4 times more likely to result in diagnosable PTSD than combat. That's a very, very important point. And one more quote from Rebecca Solnit. We know who lies about rape routinely, regularly. Rapists. Criminals tend to deny their crimes, which doesn't mean everyone accused is guilty, only that claiming innocence is a habit of the innocent and guilty alike, so it doesn't tell us much. We know that, on the other hand, false rape accusations are extremely rare. This is a moment. It is a learning opportunity for many Americans, but most will not avail themselves of it. In the Russiagate scandal, new memos surfaced in the New York Times today that were written by Andrew McCabe, who was the acting FBI director until Trump had him fired earlier this year, the day before he qualified for his pension benefits. It was a cruel move. And now McCabe is getting payback because, like James Comey, he wrote contemporaneous memos to, as his lawyer says, memorialize significant discussions he had with high-level officials and preserve them, so he would have an accurate, contemporaneous record of those discussions. So, he is accusing Rod Rosenstein of engaging in a conversation with him in May of 2017, just after Jim Comey had been fired, and that Rosenstein contemplated secretly recording conversations with Trump. And he also initiated discussions about invoking the 25th Amendment, which provides for the removal of an incapacitated president. Now, Rosenstein has issued swift and strong denials. Quote, the New York Times story is inaccurate, factually incorrect. I will not further comment on a story based on anonymous sources who are obviously biased against the department and are advancing their own personal agenda. But let me be clear about this. Based on my personal dealings with the president, there is no basis to invoke the 25th Amendment. Okay. That's interesting. On Monday, Trump announced that he was ordering declassification of the FISA court application to surveil Carter Page, certain documents related to the Mueller investigation, and text messages written by Jim Comey and Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. And today, well, he decided maybe not. He walked back his order, saying that Justice Department officials and others had persuaded him not to do so, at least for now. There was a letter from Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer arguing that he should not disclose or declassify this information. And as you know, I think that's a smokescreen. They can certainly redact any sensitive details. They always do that. But the idea that we can't see any of this information and that Trump has been somehow bullied or persuaded into changing his posture is a very curious development. And the Washington Post reports that Trump was also swayed by foreign allies, including Britain, who didn't want this released. Now, why does Britain care about the FISA court, about text messages between Comey and other FBI people? I don't get that. I just don't. But if you subscribe to the counter-conspiracy theory, or you just contemplate it, one that I have articulated here from time to time, you can see that this is the British closing ranks to protect their spies. And Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, who is tied into Orbis Communications, Christopher Steele, and Stefan Halper. We'll see where it all goes. Today, John Bolton announced that in August, Trump signed new classified executive orders for the Pentagon's cyber warriors, loosening the rules of engagement for offensive cyber attacks. And I don't think this is going to end well. We don't acknowledge the extent of our aggressive cyber warfare. We only play the victim when we get hit back. And in announcing this and bragging about it, John Bolton apparently slipped what is believed by the government that the attack on the Office of Personnel Management, which pilfered the files on 22 Americans who have security clearances, well, they don't all have security clearances, but 22 million Americans who have a file at the Office of Personnel Management, Bolton said that China was responsible for that. He said those files, my own included, maybe yours, found a new residence in Beijing. Now, for the longest time, this was blamed on either Russians or Koreans, North Koreans. And I underscore that when it comes to cyber attacks, we know that there are weapons, tools that not only obscure the origins of the hacking attack, but they actually present data that leads to another suspect. And that's another reason why I've always demanded proof of the allegations that Russia hacked the DNC and gave that to WikiLeaks. So, the gloves are off, and it probably will just lead to more problem. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And today, I want to thank two gentlemen who've been in touch here recently. Jerry Frescia, who is an expat who lives in Italy and just renewed his annual subscription, and Brian Massey, who is a great supporter of this podcast and sends me fascinating information from time to time. I'd like you to follow their lead and take out your own subscription to the Peter B. Collins Podcast. It's your way of affirming the work that I do and helping cover my costs, maybe even buy me a dinner out once in a while. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, find the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber, takes you to the sign-up page, and you can pick $5, $10, $20 a month, or $50 annual subscription. I'm ready to send a bonus CD to anybody who takes out a new annual subscription and supplies a mailing address in the continental U.S., and the CD is John Dist's powerful new American University, and it has even sparked a music video. I'm going to link to it in the show file for today's podcast so you can check it out. But John Dist is a very talented musical artist, and I would love to send you his latest CD. The Guardian, which has been busy trashing Julian Assange, broke a story today under the byline of Luke Harding. And Luke Harding is a guy who's published a book called Collusion, which doesn't prove that Russia colluded with the Trump campaign in the 2016 election. And Luke Harding is tied to some of those British organizations I mentioned, Orbis Communications, the Halyuk Group, and he is a co-author of this article telling us that last year near Christmas time, Russian diplomats had a secret plan, a scheme to extract Julian Assange from the Embassy of Ecuador in London and transport him via diplomatic vehicles and under diplomatic cover to Russia. Now, the plan was called off at the last minute. We don't know why. But The Guardian goes deep, saying, oh, this shows the close ties of Julian Assange to Russia, and they hint that it's proof that he lied about the arrangement that they say led Russia to hack documents and give them to WikiLeaks. And The Guardian reveals that Fidel Narvaez, a close confidant of Assange, who was the consul of the London Embassy of Ecuador, served as a point of contact with Moscow, but he denies it. And so we will have to see if any more details surface. But as of today, Julian Assange is still trapped at the Embassy of Ecuador in London. Kudos to Lee Fung and Alex Emmons at The Intercept for a great enterprise report. And this is about the U.S. role in supplying arms to the Saudis as they continue to brutally pummel the nation of Yemen. And I'm slightly encouraged because the blackout of coverage of the war in Yemen took a break yesterday, and the PBS NewsHour had an actual, credible report about the scene in Yemen for the first time in recent recollection. Also, yesterday there was a talk at a think tank, and our friend Medea Benjamin of Code Pink interrupted and raised a lot of questions about the U.S. support for the Saudis' brutal war in Yemen. So, the Intercept piece reports that there's been open opposition in the State Department to the U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen, and that this led to a kind of blow-up where Mike Pompeo was in a pinch because he has to certify on humanitarian grounds that everything is kosher and okie-dokie for $2 billion worth of U.S. arms to continue to be sold to the Saudis. Now, behind the scenes, what appears to have tipped the scales was the pressure from the acting Assistant Secretary of State, Charles Faulkner. Faulkner was a highly paid lobbyist for a number of military industrial complex firms, including Raytheon. And Raytheon is a leader in the recent $2 billion package of weapons sales to the Saudis. And so the article argues that in order to protect the interests of these American munitions companies like Raytheon, that Mike Pompeo falsely certified that the sales can continue. Nearby in the Middle East, there appears to be a blackout on recent violence visited on the people of Gaza. I have an email forwarded by Mark Crispin Miller of New York University from Amal Arafa, and it was dated yesterday, so it refers to events on Wednesday, the worst day since May 15th. He lists an 18-year-old named Naji Jamil Abu Asi and his cousin Ala Ziad Abu Asi, age 20. They were killed by an Israeli missile, which burned them beyond recognition. And later that same day, Mohammed Abu Naji, age 19, was shot in the chest. His friend Mohammed Omar, age 20, shot in the head. Both were killed instantly. And Mumen Abu Ayya, age 16, was shot in the head and died shortly after. By now, over 500 people have been badly wounded. Now, because we're immersed in the Kavanaugh controversy, none of this has been seen as fit to print or to broadcast in the American media. So I looked over at Haaretz, and their coverage, I didn't have time to go real deep and look for previous stories from this week, But Dateline Friday, September 21st, a Palestinian was killed, 54 wounded by Israeli live fire during protests on the border of Gaza and Israel. Suge Knight was the rapper, hip-hop mogul, and he chose to name his record label Death Row Records. And Suge's going up the river, going to spend 28 years in the big house, but he avoids a probable life sentence and a possible death sentence by entering a no-contest plea to voluntary manslaughter for running over and killing a Compton businessman nearly 4 years ago. You may recall it was on the set of the movie Straight Outta Compton, and Suge and a guy named Bone Sloan, a consultant on the movie, were involved in a fist fight, and then Knight hopped in his pickup truck and ended up running over Terry Carter, who died from his injuries. The plea deal calls for Knight to serve 22 years in prison on the manslaughter count and another 6 years because of his previous convictions. Once again, we are seeing the prospect of peaceful protest treated as potential terrorism and violent extremism. This relates to the construction of the Keystone Pipeline, and we're moving the venue from North Dakota to Montana. And Montana officials have been checking in with their counterparts in North Dakota on ways that they can deal with likely protests. But beyond just preparations, they had an anti-terrorism training session in Montana with our friends from the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, organizing a field force operations training to teach mass arrest procedures, riot control formations, and other crowd control measures. The ACLU of Montana has filed a lawsuit against the government seeking records and they earlier obtained a DHS report saying that pipeline protesters were engaged in criminal disruptions and violent incidents. This is all the pretext for a militarized response to First Amendment activists. We've seen it before. Be prepared to see it again. And finally today, as you may know, I spent some formative years in Chicago. I attended Northwestern University. I started my radio career at a station in Chicago during the Nixon administration. And at the time, I was very well aware of corruption in the Chicago Police Department, and it hasn't changed much in the 40 years since I lived in Chicago. And I want to note the passing of one of the most bloodthirsty and brutal Chicago cops, John Berge. He's accused in more than 100 cases of frame-ups, of people who were sent to prison for crimes they didn't commit. And he learned the tools of torture while he was deployed in Vietnam, and he became a cop in Chicago starting in 1970. Ronald Kitchen is one of the black men who was tortured into confessing to involvement in 5 murders, and it cost him 21 years in prison, 13 on death row. All because of John Berge and his midnight crew. I don't believe much in heaven or hell, but we often talk about the dearly departed resting in peace. I hope there's no rest for John Berge. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it far and wide, and you'll find it on YouTube. I remain your humble host, Peter B. Collins.
Happy trail.